The sandstorm came without warning, transforming Petra's rose-colored cliffs into a blur of ochre and shadow. Dr. Isabella Reynolds pressed herself against the ancient wall, protecting her face from the stinging particles as she waited for the worst to pass. The storm had scattered her team across the archaeological site, forcing them to seek shelter wherever they could find it. But Isabella wasn't entirely disappointed. The storm had revealed something extraordinary. There, in the weathered face of the cliff, where centuries of wind had carved away layers of sandstone, she saw it, a perfectly geometric pattern that nature couldn't have created. She'd been studying Petra's lesser-known monuments for 3 years, but this section of the cliff face had always appeared unremarkable. Until now. Professor Hassan. She called out as soon as the wind died down enough to be heard. Her colleague materialized from a nearby crevice, brushing sand from his graying beard. Look at this pattern. The storm must have stripped away the outer layer. Rashid Hassan adjusted his glasses, squinting at the wall. Remarkable. This isn't Nabatean design. The symmetry is different. He ran his fingers along the edges of the geometric pattern, his expression growing more puzzled. These aren't tool marks either. It's as if the stone itself was transformed. Isabella pulled out her tablet, taking detailed photographs despite the lingering dust in the air. The pattern resembled a spiral, but with angles instead of curves, creating an almost hypnotic effect. At its center was a depression no larger than a coin. "We need to document this properly," she said, already composing an email to the Department of Antiquities in her head. "This could change everything we thought we knew about." Her words cut off as her finger brushed against the central depression. A low vibration hummed through the rock, more felt than heard. Fine sand cascaded from hidden seams in the cliff face, revealing lines that connected to the spiral pattern. The vibration intensified, and Isabella stepped back, watching in amazement as sections of the wall began to shift and realign like pieces of an ancient puzzle. "Impossible," Rashid whispered, his usual academic composure shattered. This level of mechanical complexity. The Nabateans were advanced. But this. The wall continued its transformation until a doorway stood before them, leading into absolute darkness. Cool air wafted from the opening, carrying a scent that made Isabella's nose wrinkle, not the musty smell of a long-sealed tomb, but something sharper, almost metallic. "We need to alert the authorities," Rashid said, reaching for his phone. "This requires a full team, proper documentation. We need to take a quick look first," Isabella interrupted, already pulling out her flashlight. "Just to assess what we're dealing with. If this is what I think it is." She let the thought hang unfinished. For years, she theorized that Petra held secrets far older than the Nabatean civilization, that the Rose City had been chosen as a building site because something was already there, something ancient and significant. The beam of her flashlight revealed a corridor that shouldn't have existed. The walls were perfectly smooth, almost glassy, with no tool marks or signs of human construction. Strange symbols flickered along the surfaces, seeming to absorb and reflect light in impossible ways. "Dr. Reynolds, please." Rashid's voice carried a note of warning. "We should wait." A sound echoed from the darkness ahead, a grinding of stone on stone, followed by what could have been whispers in a language Isabella had never heard. Her flashlight beam caught something moving in the shadows, something that didn't match any explanation her rational mind could provide. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rashid nodded slowly, his face pale. "We need to seal this entrance. Now." But Isabella took a step forward instead. The symbols on the walls began to pulse with a faint luminescence, responding to her presence. Her flashlight flickered, and in that moment of darkness, she felt something brush past her, not physical contact, but a sensation like fingers moving through her thoughts. The next flash of her light revealed a chamber ahead, its walls covered in murals that depicted things that made her scientific mind revel. Beings that were neither human nor animal, geometric shapes that hurt her eyes to look at, and scenes of events that could never have happened on Earth. A metallic taste filled her mouth as she stepped into the chamber, and she heard Rashid calling her name from what seemed like a great distance. The walls were alive with shifting patterns now, and in the center of the room stood something that defied description. A structure that seemed to exist in more dimensions than human eyes were meant to perceive. Her flashlight died completely, but the chamber remained dimly lit by the pulsing symbols. And in that otherworldly glow, Isabella realized she could no longer hear Rashid's voice. When she turned to look back at the entrance, she found only a solid wall, as if the doorway had never existed. She wasn't alone in the chamber. Something was in there with her, something that had waited millennia for someone to find this place. And as the temperature dropped and the whispers grew louder, Isabella Reynolds understood that she had just made the greatest archaeological discovery in human history, and possibly the most terrible mistake of her life. The darkness spoke to Isabella in frequencies that human ears weren't meant to process. She pressed her back against the chamber wall, fumbling with her dead flashlight, trying to convince herself that the shadows weren't moving. But they were. The darkness had weight, substance, intention. Professor Hassan. Her voice sounded wrong, as if the air itself was different here. No response came from beyond the sealed entrance. The wall-mounted symbols cast an eerie phosphorescence that made the chamber feel like the inside of a diseased heart, pulsing with sickly light. Her archaeological training kicked in, a desperate attempt to impose rational thought on an irrational situation. The chamber was roughly circular, about 40 feet in diameter. The walls curved upward to a ceiling she couldn't quite see, lost in shadows that seemed to writhe and twist. But it was the floor that demanded attention, an intricate mosaic of black stone, and some metallic substance she couldn't identify, forming patterns that drew the eye inward toward the center. And there, in the heart of the chamber, stood what she had first mistaken for a structure. Now, with her eyes adjusting to the strange light, she realized it was more like a tear in reality, a vertical rupture in space that somehow managed to look both geometric and organic at the same time. It stood about 12 feet tall, its edges constantly shifting, as if reality itself couldn't quite decide how to perceive it. The whispers grew stronger, and Isabella felt pressure building in her skull. Images began flooding her mind. Vast cities built at impossible angles, beings that moved between dimensions as easily as she walked down a street, knowledge that human minds weren't equipped to process. She fell to her knees, overcome by the assault on her senses. "Stop," she gasped, and surprisingly, the whispers receded. The pressure in her head eased, replaced by a single, clear thought that wasn't her own. "We have waited so long." Isabella forced herself to stand, her legs shaking. "What are you?" The response came not in words but in concepts, flooding her mind with images of beings that existed before Earth had fully cooled, who had walked between stars and shaped reality itself. They had been imprisoned here, sealed away by. The image that followed made her retch. Beings of pure light who had deemed them too dangerous to exist in normal spacetime. "The Nabateans," she said aloud, piecing it together. "They didn't build here by accident. They were guardians, primitive servants of our jailers," the thought came. Generation after generation, watching without understanding. "But you are different. You can comprehend. You can help." The shadows in the chamber condensed, taking on forms that made Isabella's mind recoil. They weren't exactly physical, more like holes in reality shaped vaguely like human silhouettes. They moved around her in a slow circle, and she felt their attention like a physical weight. "Help with what?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. The tear in reality at the center of the chamber pulsed, and for a moment, Isabella saw through it, saw a realm of existence that operated under laws that would drive Einstein mad. The beams there made the shadow forms around her look simple by comparison. "Free us," the thought came. "We will share knowledge beyond human dreams, power beyond human comprehension." Isabella took a step back, her heel catching on the edge of the mosaic pattern. "And if I refuse?" The temperature in the chamber dropped dramatically. The shadow forms moved closer, their edges becoming sharper, more defined. The whispers returned, but now they carried emotions. Anger, hunger, an ancient and terrible patience. Then you will join the others who discovered this place. Their essence sustains us. Their memories entertain us. Their screams. The thought was cut off by a new sound, rhythmic pounding from beyond the sealed entrance. Isabella heard Rashid's voice, distorted but recognizable, calling her name. The shadow forms rippled with agitation. Choose, the thought commanded. Free us or join us. The door will soon reopen, and others will enter. Perhaps they will be more cooperative. Isabella's mind raced. The pounding at the entrance grew louder, and she could hear more voices now. The rest of her team must have gathered. The shadow forms pressed closer, their edges beginning to blur with her own shadow, and she felt a cold that went beyond physical sensation. She had spent her career searching for secrets, convinced that the past held wonders waiting to be discovered. Now she stood in the presence of something ancient beyond comprehension, offered knowledge that could revolutionize human understanding of the universe itself. All she had to do was free them. The whispers grew more insistent, and in their cacophony, she caught glimpses of truth, of what these beings had done to earn their imprisonment, of what they would do if released. The images made her blood run cold. The entrance was beginning to shift, the wall slowly reconfiguring itself. Soon it would open, and her colleagues would enter, unprepared for what waited inside. The shadow forms wavered with anticipation, and Isabella felt their hunger, not just for freedom, but for what they would do once they were free. She had wanted to make history. Now she had to decide what kind of history she would make, and how many would suffer for her choice. The whispers pressed against her mind, offering power, knowledge, transcendence. The shadows reached for her with fingers that could touch thoughts, and Isabella Reynolds made her decision. Isabella's decision crystallized in the moment. She felt those shadow fingers brush her consciousness. With deliberate movements, she reached into her bag and withdrew her field journal, leather-bound, filled with her careful notes and theories about Petra's hidden history. All wrong, she now knew. So catastrophically wrong. You want to be free, she called out, her voice stronger than she felt. You want to share knowledge. She held up the journal, then threw it directly into the center of the geometric tear in reality. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The tear pulsed, its edges distorting as if in pain. The shadow forms recoiled, their shapes twisting in ways that defied physics. A sound filled the chamber. Not quite a scream, not quite a frequency. Something that made Isabella's teeth vibrate and her vision blur. What have you done? The thought crashed into her mind with such force that she staggered. Introduced a physical object from our dimension into your containment barrier, she gasped, fighting to stay conscious. My hypothesis: your prison works by keeping your dimension separate from ours. Any breach goes both ways. The chamber began to shake. The symbols on the walls flared brilliantly, no longer pulsing but blazing with constant light. The shadow forms moved frantically now, their edges dissolving and reforming as the tear in reality began to contract. You understand nothing, the thought came, filled with rage and something else. Fear, the knowledge we offered, the power, would come with a price too high for humanity to pay. Isabella finished. I saw what you did to the civilizations that came before. I saw what you'd do to us. The entrance was opening faster now, the stone reconfiguring itself with increasing speed. Isabella heard her colleagues' voices more clearly, heard their exclamations of surprise and awe. She had to end this before they entered. The shadow forms rushed at her, their cold essence trying to penetrate her mind, to take control. But the barrier between dimensions was becoming more stable, strengthened by the paradox she had introduced. Each attempt they made to touch her physical form only accelerated the process. Isabella, Rashid's voice cut through the chaos. Step back from there. She turned to see her colleagues flooding into the chamber, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, their faces masks of concern and wonder. But they didn't see what she saw. The shadow forms were becoming transparent, the tear in reality shrinking to a pinpoint. Others will come. The final thought sliced through her mind. Others will find us, and not all will choose as you have chosen. The symbols on the walls dimmed suddenly, plunging the chamber into darkness broken only by the beams of flashlights. When the emergency lights were set up, Isabella saw that the chamber looked different, smaller, ordinary, its walls marked with typical Nabatean carvings. The tear in reality was gone, and with it, the shadow forms and whispers. Dr. Reynolds, one of her junior colleagues, approached, face full of concern. "Are you all right?" When the entrance sealed. "I'm fine," she said, though she knew she would never be truly fine again. The knowledge of what lay beneath Petra's surface, of what still waited despite her actions, would haunt her forever. Isabella managed a weak smile. If he only knew how right he was, and how dangerous that knowledge could be. The chamber had reverted to its original form, or perhaps this was what normal human minds were capable of perceiving. But she knew the truth. She could still feel echoes of those alien thoughts, could still see afterimages of that impossible tear in reality when she closed her eyes. "We need to seal this chamber," she said firmly. "Not just close it, seal it completely. And we need to do it now." Her colleagues stared at her in disbelief. Rashid stepped forward, his face a mixture of concern and confusion. But the historical significance, the archaeological importance. "Some things," Isabella interrupted, "are more important than archaeology. Some secrets need to stay buried." She looked around the chamber one last time, knowing that the entities were still there, just beyond the veil of normal space-time, waiting. "Trust me on this, Professor Hassan. Please." The look in her eyes must have conveyed something of what she had experienced, because Rashid nodded slowly. "I'll contact the authorities immediately. We'll cite structural instability." As her team began documenting the chamber, seeing only what their minds could comprehend, Isabella felt the weight of her new responsibility settle onto her shoulders. She would have to find a way to ensure this place remained sealed, to prevent others from making the discovery she had made. The beings behind the veil were patient, and they were clever. They would wait for someone more susceptible to their promises, someone who wouldn't understand the true cost of the knowledge they offered. The whispers had faded, but Isabella knew they weren't gone. They would never be truly gone. They would echo in her dreams, reminding her of what lurked beneath the rose-colored cliffs of Petra, of the choice she had made, and of the choices others might make in the future. 3 months after the discovery of the chamber, Isabella sat in her office at the University of Jordan, staring at her computer screen without really seeing it. The official report had been filed, documenting a structurally unstable chamber of minor archaeological significance. The site had been sealed with concrete and steel, marked as hazardous, and largely forgotten by most of the archaeological community. But the dreams hadn't stopped. Every night, she saw them. Geometries that shouldn't exist, beams that moved between thoughts as easily as humans moved through air. And recently, something worse had started. She'd begun to understand them. A knock at her door jolted her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called, quickly closing the document she'd been working on, a private journal documenting everything she remembered from the chamber, written in a code of her own devising. Dr. James Kavanaugh entered, his usual confident stride somewhat subdued. The American archaeologist had arrived 2 weeks ago, supposedly to collaborate on a study of Nabatean water systems. But Isabella had seen him asking questions about the sealed chamber, had noticed his unusual interest in the geometric patterns found in Petra's lesser-known monuments. "Dr. Reynolds," he said, closing the door behind him, "I think it's time we had an honest conversation." Isabella felt her pulse quicken, but kept her face neutral. "About the water systems. About what you found beneath Petra." He placed a leather-bound book on her desk. Her breath caught. It was identical to the journal she had thrown into the tear in reality. Or more specifically, about what found you. She stood slowly, her hand moving toward the phone on her desk. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The whispers," he said softly. You still hear them, don't you? In your dreams. But they're not just whispers anymore. They're becoming clearer, more comprehensible. Isabella's hand froze halfway to the phone. How do you? Because I've been studying them for years. He opened the book, revealing pages of dense notes and diagrams. There are other sites, Dr. Reynolds. Other chambers. What you found in Petra isn't unique. It's part of a network, a prison system created by beings we can barely comprehend, to contain something even they feared. The temperature in the office seemed to drop. Isabella saw shadows move in the corners of her vision, but when she turned to look, they were gone. Why are you telling me this? Because they're getting stronger. Kavanaugh's face was grim. The barriers are weakening. What you did in Petra, throwing your journal into the tear, it was brilliant. It bought us time, but it's not a permanent solution. Isabella sank back into her chair. We? Who exactly are you working with? There's a group of us. Archaeologists, physicists, theologians, people who found these chambers and made the same choice you did. We call ourselves the Watchers, following the tradition of those who came before. The Nabateans were just one link in a very long chain. Outside her window, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across her office. One of them seemed to move against the light, and this time she knew she wasn't imagining it. They're listening, she whispered. Kavanaugh nodded. They always are, but we've learned to shield our thoughts, to speak in ways they can't fully comprehend. That's why I'm here. We need your help, Dr. Reynolds. Your mind. Your ability to understand their nature while resisting their influence. It's rare. Help with what? Finding the other chambers before someone else does. Someone who might make a different choice than you did. And more importantly, he hesitated, glancing at the shadows. We think we found a way to strengthen the barriers permanently. But we need someone who's made direct contact, someone who's touched their consciousness and survived with their sanity intact. Isabella looked down at her hands, remembering the cold touch of those shadow fingers on her thoughts. And if we fail, then what's imprisoned beneath Petra, beneath all these sites around the world, won't stay imprisoned much longer. He met her gaze steadily. You've seen what they are, what they want. Imagine that unleashed upon our world. The shadows in her office grew longer as the sun dipped below the horizon. In the growing darkness, Isabella could almost see those impossible geometries again, could almost hear the whispers that had haunted her dreams. But now she understood something else. She wasn't alone. Others had faced this choice, had stood against the temptation of forbidden knowledge, and chosen to protect humanity instead. When do we start? She asked. Kavanaugh's relief was visible. Tonight. We need to move quickly. They're getting stronger, and they're not the only ones who've noticed these chambers. There are others, groups who want to free them, who believe they can control what they don't understand. As if in response to his words, Isabella's computer screen flickered, displaying for just a moment a pattern of symbols she recognized from the chamber. The shadows pulsed, and she felt that familiar pressure in her mind. But this time, she was ready for it. Then we better get to work, she said, standing up. But first, you need to tell me everything you know. No more secrets, no more half-truths. If we're going to face this, we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. Kavanaugh nodded, reaching into his bag for more documents. It began long before recorded history. He started, his voice low and urgent. When beings of light and beings of shadow fought for control of realities we can barely imagine. The ancient library beneath the Vatican wasn't on any official map. Isabella followed Kavanaugh through narrow corridors, lined with texts that predated Christianity, her flashlight beam revealing glimpses of languages that had never been officially documented. The Watcher's true archive, where the real history of humanity's brush with interdimensional entities was recorded. 3 weeks had passed since their conversation in her office. 3 weeks of learning the truth about the chambers, about the beings imprisoned within them, and about the price humanity had paid to keep them contained. The shadows followed them everywhere now, more bold than ever before. "They're getting stronger faster than we anticipated," Kavanaugh said, stopping before a heavy iron door, marked with symbols similar to those from the Petra chamber. The last site in Turkey was completely compromised. "We lost 2 good people." Isabella felt the weight of his words. She'd been there, had seen what happened when the barriers failed even partially. The images still haunted her. "Have you decoded the final sequence?" "Almost." He pulled out a key that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "But there's something else. Something we didn't tell you before." He hesitated, his hand on a lock. "The strengthening ritual. It requires a sacrifice." The temperature dropped suddenly, and Isabella felt the familiar pressure of otherworldly attention focusing on them. What kind of sacrifice? A conscious mind. Someone who's touched their consciousness and remained intact. Someone who can serve as an anchor for the new barriers. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "Someone like you." The shadows in the corridor writhed with what felt like anticipation. Isabella took a step back. "You knew this all along." "We didn't have a choice. The barriers are failing worldwide. Without the ritual, they'll break free within months. Billions will die, and those who survive." He shuddered. "What they'll become will be worse than death." Isabella pressed her hands to her temples, trying to block out the alien consciousness that had become increasingly present in her thoughts. "There has to be another way." "We've searched for centuries," Kavanaugh said softly. "This is the only solution we've found that works permanently." The original barriers were created the same way, with conscious minds serving as anchors. That's what the Nabateans and others really were. Not just guardians, but living locks. The iron door swung open silently, revealing a circular chamber that made Isabella's eyes hurt to look at. The architecture seemed to fold in on itself, creating spaces that shouldn't exist in 3-dimensional reality. At its center stood an altar that appeared to be made of solid shadow. "Yes," the voices whispered. "See how they would use you, just as the Lightbringers used those who came before. Join us instead. Free us. We offer a different path." Images flooded her mind, power beyond human comprehension, knowledge that could revolutionize every field of science, the ability to reshape reality itself. All she had to do was walk away. "The choice has to be willing," Kavanaugh said, reading her expression. "The sacrifice has to be conscious, accepted. Otherwise, it won't work." Isabella closed her eyes, remembering what she'd seen in that first chamber in Petra. The truth behind the entity's offers, the civilizations they'd destroyed, the realities they'd twisted into nightmares. She thought of the billions of lives at stake, of the future they'd forfeit if these beings ever broke free. "How long do I have to decide?" "Minutes. The alignment we need is already beginning." He gestured to where the shadows were gathering, forming patterns that made her mind recoil. "Whatever you choose, it has to be now." Isabella Reynolds had spent her life seeking knowledge, trying to uncover the mysteries of the past. Now she understood why some mysteries were meant to stay buried, why some knowledge came at too high a price. She thought of all the others who must have stood where she stood, who had made the same choice across millennia. "Will it hurt?" she asked quietly. "No," Kavanaugh answered, then hesitated. "But you'll be conscious. Aware. Forever." "Forever is a very long time," the voices whispered. "We would give you a different eternity." Isabella took a deep breath and stepped toward the altar. The shadows surged around her, both trying to stop her and drawn to her decision. She felt their cold touch on her mind, their desperate attempt to sway her. "Start the ritual," she said firmly, "before I change my mind." Kavanaugh began to chant in a language that hurt her ears, drawing symbols in the air that left trailing afterimages. The shadows coalesced, becoming more solid, more real. Isabella felt reality beginning to bend around her. As her consciousness began to merge with the barrier between dimensions, becoming part of the ancient prison that held back the darkness, Isabella had one final thought. Some prices were worth paying, some sacrifices worth making. In choosing to become a guardian, she was protecting not just humanity, but all of reality from what lurked beyond the veil. The last thing she heard before her individual consciousness dissolved into the eternal barrier was Kavanaugh's whispered words. "The Watchers will remember you, Isabella. Always." And then she became something else. Not quite human anymore, but not quite gone. A conscious lock in an infinite prison, keeping at bay horrors that humanity was never meant to face. The price of knowledge, paid in full. In the years that followed, visitors to Petra would sometimes report strange sensations near the sealed chamber, a feeling of being watched, of being protected. Some claimed to hear whispers in unknown languages, or see shadows moving against the light. But the barriers held strong, reinforced by the sacrifice of one who understood exactly what she was protecting. And in the darkness between dimensions, Isabella Reynolds stood eternal guard, her consciousness spread across the barriers, keeping safe the world she'd left behind. The greatest archaeological discovery in history remained buried, and humanity slept safely, unaware of the price paid for their protection. The end.